I'm going to talk about the politics and everything about birth, the legal aspects. This is unscripted, so it'll be interesting to see how and where it goes. I filed a case against the UK government for not providing for midwifery, for home birth, for choices in childbirth. So the International Human Rights Law, United Nations Convention on Human Rights, Article 8 is the right to private and family life. That includes how and where to birth and with who. Various cases come up from time to time. There was recently a case in the USA, in Nebraska, where a woman had a home birth with an unlicensed midwife, and the state charged the midwife with criminal neglect for the child who later died. It was a breech birth, it was complex, and there was a multiple of reasons that contributed to that sad event. But the judge did rule that the midwife was chosen by the family and the family have rights to choose who they like. The case of Hungary in the European Court was Ternovsky versus Hungary, which said that there was no real home birth provision of midwives. The midwife there, Agnes Gereb, was jailed and just persecuted really by the state. So that's a theme that comes up in all countries. And it's interesting to see when a medical practitioner gets a birth wrong, for example, a breech birth extraction where they're pulling a baby instead of receiving a baby or disengaging, rotating ahead, but they tend to want to pull babies because that's their training. When they get it wrong, as a UK doctor very badly got it wrong and the baby died, there's no criminal case against them, but there are very commonly criminal cases against midwives. So we have a kind of I think, an archetype of psychology of the woman, the witch, she did something wrong, let's blame her. Whereas the patriarchal male, generally dominated medical profession, now it's very female dominated, but the patriarchal model continues, and that's one of control, of fear, of pathology, of thinking there's something wrong, we have to fix it, or there will be something wrong, so we have to prevent it. And the way we prevent it is do surgery or give drugs, not listen to the baby, listen to the mother, and look at the unique individual circumstances. This is something often missed, and it's a very strong aspect of a defense. People say, for example, in Nebraska in USA, it's illegal to have a home birth. No, the licensed midwives who work in the hospital are not licensed to do home birth. That doesn't make it illegal. You can't make it any more illegal than you could making love at home, unless that's going to be controlled in hospitals, which let's hope that's not the case. So people, and that's news media outlets, they're not so well informed, and they could be if they would like to be, talk to people in different areas, but they get people to fit the narrative they want, and they perpetuate stories, often very fear-based. We saw in Australia a 5-year criminal case against a midwife who deregistered as a midwife because families and hospitals asked her to help with breech and twin births. She did the best she could. Sometimes there are deaths. As I said, when there's deaths in hospital, not only are they not investigated by the police, even the medical council will very forgivingly say, well, that was one mistake. And in the case I mentioned earlier, the UK doctor and the breech baby who died, it was a 25-week gestation baby. The mother's cervix was 4 centimetres open. That's not really big enough for a baby to come out. A cesarean was indicated, but she thought she could persuade the cervix to open and too much pressure on the baby. She had worked 24 hours. I've seen lots of common situations in many hospitals, London hospitals, big university hospitals around the world, Australia and New Zealand included, where doctors even have a foot on the bed and they're pulling with the forceps and babies come out battered, bruised, damaged, cuts on the head, cuts on the face, sometimes with brain damage and cerebral palsy. Many countries in Europe don't even register these events. So we don't know how bad it is because it's very underreported. And yet we see children growing up, they're living in homes, and we're very much the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff. we're not looking at how did that happen, how to prevent it again. So even in London fairly recently, there was a breech birth where a baby died, ambulance crew arrived and they didn't send a midwife. So there was no skilled birth practitioner and certainly no skilled breech birth practitioner there. And these are so-called civilized countries, and actually the UK does collect statistics on deaths and is very transparent and honest to some extent. But then we've had inquiries and independent investigations showing that actually the government state hospitals do hide information. They hide it from parents. They're very resistant. They're afraid of litigation. And this fear drives a lot of over-medicalisation and a lot of deception. So even the lawyers are deceptive. And, I have legal cases from time to time, actually quite a few. And it's surprising how deceptive the lawyers are. Even coroners can get it wrong. So when a doctor, for example, might tell a coroner, oh, the death was natural causes, the coroner may not investigate. When the coroner is obliged to investigate, I'm also aware of other deaths, particularly in Europe, where again, a doctor said, oh, it's natural causes. How do they know from outside the body? Nobody looked inside. Nobody even did a blood test. And it's, in lots of ways, kind of criminal what is missed, what is done in the name of the state. So the point of this is a bit of might sound like a conspiracy theory, but, and why not? The state is not facilitating choices in childbirth that include home birth. It's banning midwives. It's saying, for example, you have to have indemnity insurance even when it's not available. So how is that possible? What that causes is unassisted births, or women to go to hospitals where they've been previously traumatised. They're so terrified that they'll have an elective cesarean, perhaps, to prevent another traumatic birth. So why are women traumatised? Again, because of control, a very under-resourced state-run hospitals, even private hospitals, which are much resource rich with staff ratio to women. You might have 1 to 3, 4, 5 women, and in labour 1 to 1 in a private hospital, and I've worked in them, including in London. In Australia, they've got a law saying that a midwife should only work with a certain number. I think it's 4 or 5 or 6 women. In London or the rest of the UK, there's no limit. You can have 20, 30 women, and it's just impossible. And in Europe, it's actually worse than the UK. I say Europe is a general blanket term. I mean, it reaches from the Baltic down to Portugal, from Scandinavia down to Greece, and it's very, very diverse and different. But fundamentally, it's medieval. They generally are practicing some good practices, but not enough respect for the human right to private and family life. So they're closing birth centres in Norway and across Scandinavia. There's a few good birth centres open and amazing people run them and keep them going, but they're all under threat. When we should be doing the opposite, we should be decentralising, bringing into the community, supporting families, supporting partners to support their partner, supporting doulas so that they can have the wonderful role that doulas have of very non-clinical, very compassionate, to go where the woman goes without judgment, just being with them. But they also are probably traumatised. Midwives are traumatised. There's secondary trauma. Imagine the death of a baby that a doctor has done. I don't mean to be blaming the doctors. Their medical training is wrong. They need more holistic training. Some doctors will work outside the box, outside comfort zones. They will do breech by sitting on their hands, wait and watch, and hands off the breech until or unless there's a real need to do something, whether it's breech or twins. Now twins, we don't know. They can both be, I'm a twin born at home and I have twin boys born by cesarean. But you could have them in a locked position. The first one comes out, the second one turns. So everything's unpredictable. Some of my colleagues talk about birth. This will be an easy one. We have no idea till the birth happens. Anybody could hemorrhage, any complication can happen with a baby. That doesn't mean hospital's safer than home. Home is statistically safer than hospital. If you're in a place where people are sitting around with equipment, technology, and a medical mindset, they're going to use those things. If you go in there with a normal pregnancy, it's very likely you will have an abnormal event, a birth, because you'll get given drugs and you'll react to the drugs, or you'll have an ideology, a way of speaking to you from their psychology, from their philosophy of control. How's the pain? What's wrong with you? What do you need fixing? So very rare, a few people slip through. Often women having quite quick births, could be their first birth, but tends to be second, third and others. And they're too quick for anybody to get time to really mess up the birth. And I have worked in hospitals with 10,000 births a year, some with 2,000 births a year. I've also been in cottage little hospitals with 200 births a year. I've worked on case loading teams, and these are the best. The continuity, the relationship of knowing the family, knowing the woman, and the woman knowing the midwife. That deep trust is also deep clinical knowledge. We know some of their history, but we know what their face looks like, what their oxygen levels look like. And when something changes, we know that instinctively, intuitively on a deep level. And this guides us. If we've just met somebody for a short time, we have very good clinical assessment tools and equipment. If we're working outside the hospital, we have to rely more on our skills and equipment. And we go the extra mile. What can we do or not do to facilitate this birth? Quite often it's not doing something. For example, being on the bed is an intervention. Some women want to get off the bed and they're spoken to or expected to be on the bed, and then they end up pleasing others to be a good little girl. So I started this talk about the kind of politics of birth, the almost conspiracy, and my action against the UK government could be against any and every government, that it's failing to provide choices in childbirth, particularly home birth, and to provide midwives. And that was the case 2012, Ternavosky versus Hungary. In Strasbourg, the European Court said the state has an obligation to provide these choices, and then it's had a few more cases which have weakened that judgment. But that doesn't matter too much. We can all stand up through our actions for what is the best way to work. And for midwives, doulas, doctors who want to work with empowered families with informed choice, not coercion, but really informed consent, then we need to develop the skills for breech birth, for twin birth, for physiological birth, for home birth, and develop continuity care models. And that's been identified in all the reports, Cumberledge in the UK and others, Changing Childbirth decades ago. Nothing happens, and it won't happen unless we take action. So sometimes the action is a shift in consciousness, just thinking it, dreaming it, believing it, beginning it. Other things, legal actions, like I do. And if anybody wants to know more about the legal actions, it will be posted on the Human Rights Action Facebook page, and some talks like this will be put out, probably on YouTube and other places. So I welcome people's collaboration, ideas. Sharing ideas is very helpful because it's very similar the world over. And what we want is a happy, functional society, and how we are born matters. If we look at how were we born individually, I mentioned I'm a home birth twin born at home with a surprise twin behind me. So I've grown up thinking, well, that's normal. And I facilitate birth because I aim to keep everything normal. And if it deviates, we can often prevent problems, predict them. But if we have to transfer, we do. But this is less than 5% of women really need intervention in hospital. Now that is separate from comorbidities of diabetes, obesity, heart and lung, kidney disease, liver disease. These women have absolute need for hospital care. And I've worked a lot of my career in intensive care for adults, for children, and for neonatal babies. So I've seen the complications, and some people really benefit from help. But most people can birth, not saying they need to birth at home, but they can birth without interventions. In birth centres would be ideal. So the birthplace study is a UK piece of research that shows statistically you are safer out of the hospital in the birthplace. Thank you, and I look forward to sharing ideas.